I invite you to be seated. I invite kids to come forward if we have some kids that want to come up today. Let it shine. We can sing. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine. Come on, you can be a kid today. Gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. It's really too bad we don't have some kids here today because I had something interesting I was going to tell you about. And it has to do with a plethora of pictures that I see of Jesus turning up in ordinary things and then becoming sacred experiences of some kind. And I put together a collection of pictures here because sometimes Jesus' face shows up in a towel hanging on the towel stand. Here's a close-up just to make sure everyone can see that. And sometimes Jesus shows up in a piece of toast. And sometimes Jesus shows up as a scorch in the bottom of a frying pan or a scorch on an iron. And sometimes, believe it or not, Jesus even shows up in the peel of a banana. Now, I happen to believe that God is present in the fruits of the earth. But I also have to wonder a little bit at Jesus showing up in the peel of a banana. I think that's something altogether different. So we were going to talk a little bit about images of God. Images of God's Son, our Lord, showing up in the midst of the world and where that image might be found. And we can think about that a little bit as we talk about our lessons and our readings for today. Because, as Pastor Lene said, today is Christ the King Sunday. And we need to reconcile or deal with, engage what it means for us to proclaim Christ King in this world. You know, there's one miracle that appears in all four of the Gospels, all four of the biblical Gospels. Only one. Many miracles, many that show up in one or two, but there's only one that shows up in all four of the Gospels. Do you know what this is? It's the feeding miracle. It's the feeding of the 5,000. And Matthew and Mark even have a feeding of the 4,000 that takes place in the region of the Decapolis. So the Gentiles are fed too. But the central feeding miracle, the feeding of the 5,000, is the only one that shows up in all four of our biblical Gospels. Feeding is central to God's presence and action in the world. When God is present and active in the world, the hungry are fed. In body and in soul, in all ways. And it's interesting that in John's gospel, only in John's gospel, right at the end of that story, right after our lectionary text leaves off in telling the story of the feeding of the 5,000 from the Gospel of John, there's another line that just slays me. It says, after all of the people have been fed, and all of the baskets of leftovers have been gathered. You remember how many? 12 baskets of leftovers. There's enough and more beside, enough for all the people of God, symbolic of the 12 tribes. After all of this happens, and our reading usually stops, the next line in John's gospel is, and Jesus, knowing that they were going to come and take him by force and make him king, returned up the mountain. Jesus, knowing that the throngs that he had just fed were going to come and take him by force and proclaim him king over them, rejected that and returned up the mountain to pray. The people were going to make him king right then and there, and he knew it, and he resisted it. This is the one we proclaim king in all the world, Lord of lords and ruler of all. This day, Christ the King Sunday, New Year's Eve day in the church. And when presented with this prospect of being king over all of the people, he goes away to a place by himself. This issue of kingship has been an interesting thing for him to deal with and for us to deal with as Christians because king considerations begin early on in the nativity story. When Jesus is born, Magi, wise men from the east, come to visit Herod, the king of the Jews. King in title only. We know who the king is in this world, right? The Roman emperor. But Herod, titular king over the Jews. The Magi come and visit him saying, "Where is the one who is born king of the Jews? For we have seen his star at its rising, and we have come with gifts to pay him homage." You know the story. It's coming up again in the cycle of our seasonal observances. The nativity story, the visit of the Magi. Where is the one born king of the Jews? And of course, King Herod encourages them. You remember what he says? Yes, go and find him. And when you do, come back and tell me so that I can go and pay him homage too, to worship the king. And it's present in the latter bracket of his life as well. In a mock trial conducted by the agent of the operative king, people bring forth these charges against Jesus and say, yeah, he's been telling us to refuse to pay our taxes to Caesar. He says he's going to destroy the temple, and he's been proclaiming himself Messiah and king. And of all these things, it's the one issue that Pilate picks up on and says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Because that is sedition. That is treason against the emperor. That is someone proclaiming themselves king, which is a role and authority that only belongs to him. That'll get you killed. And indeed it does. And on the cross, people taunt Jesus and say, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself and us, come down." This blasphemous mockery. And above his head, a sign, a placard. In rye, we see it in a lot of paintings, a lot of art, right? Yetsu Nazaret Rex Iudai, in rye. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. And here in the midst of his life and his ministry, this issue of kingship plagues him. People want to come and make him king. And it makes the leadership of the people at the time, the religious leadership, the Sadducees in the temple and the Pharisees in the street, and the political, civil leadership, the Sanhedrin, the council of the people, makes them very nervous, makes them downright fearful. This talk of kings. Because they know where all of that rule and authority reside in their world. And it makes them afraid when someone begins this kind of talk. And they can remember from their history, the people of God have had a long and sordid history with kings. Some sterling reformers like Josiah, many louses and murderers and despotic people that serve as king over one divided nation or another, Israel or Judah. And they can hearken back to a time in their own writings when Samuel, kind of on the hinge between the judges and the prophets, talks to them about kings. They cry out for a king. This is in 1 Samuel in chapter 8, if you ever want to check it out. The people are crying out for a king then because they realize that they are under the heel of one oppressor or another at any given time. And this alarming cycle to their life has begun to emerge. They can see that no sooner do they arrive at some place of relative stability and prosperity, they almost immediately begin to spiral down again. They fall out of love with God. They begin to worship other things, placing other things in God's place in life. And this cycle begins again. And at the bottom, when they are oppressed They cry out to God, "Save us," and God is faithful to raise up a judge, a deliverer. This is the whole cycle of the judges, and it happens time and time and time again. And they begin to look around and they realize there's one difference between them and all of the people that lord it over them. They don't have a king. And they say this to Samuel, who's kind of the last of the judges, first of the prophets. "Give us a king to rule over us." And of course, Samuel's immediate response is, "You have one." And they say, "No, we want a king like these other nations, these other empires have kings, because then we will be great as they are. Give us a king." And so Samuel prays to God in 1 Samuel. He says, "Lord, this is what they're calling me to do." And God says, in this sort of first-person conversational way, "Give it to them. Let them have it." Because they're asking for a king like the kings of the earth. They're not asking for a king like the one who currently reigns. But tell them what it's going to be like when they have a king like other nations. Tell them that this king is going to take their young men and put them in the vanguard of his armies. Tell them that this king is going to take their young women and make them camp cooks and fire tenders in the camps of the armies. Tell them that this king is going to take all of the produce of their flocks and herds, their farms and fields, all of the wealth that they accumulate is going to come to this king. Tell them that that's what's going to happen. And the people cry out for a king nonetheless. And God gives them Saul. Whether with a sense of humor or a sense of ultimate irony, God gives them Saul. And then begins a cycle, a litany, generations of kings who rule over a fractious people, constantly at odds with the world around them. The people want to come and make Jesus king. And yet, there's so much doubt about his identity. There's so much question about his very identity at this time. John the Baptist, imprisoned by Herod Antipas, sends his people to Jesus' people, telling them, "Go and ask him, are you the one, or are we to wait for another?" John the Baptist. Because he doesn't look like what they're expecting. He doesn't look like a king. He certainly doesn't act like one. People want to make him king, he goes up on a mountain to pray. This is the one who says that the last will be first and the first will be last, turning this world upside down. This is the one who says the one who would be the ruler of all, the king and lord of all, must become, you know it, the servant of all. This is not your ordinary earthly king. This is not what people are expecting. This is the one who says, with regard to your enemies, pray for them. Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. This is the one that people would make king over them. And yet this is the one that we proclaim king this day. Christ the King Sunday. We're about to start now into the brand new year in the cycle of the church. This great cycle begins all over again in godly play, in our Bible studies, in our liturgical observances and worship. And we will begin to prepare ourselves for the one that God is sending, for the King who is to come. And what kind of dispensation, what kind of rule and reign will this be? Let's look to our gospel reading for today. On what basis is justice meted? On what basis is judgment made in our gospel reading today? I think it's just delicious that this happens right around Reformation, that we get this reading. Because did you hear the word faith in our gospel reading today? Did you hear that or see that go by? I didn't. And we've just celebrated, it is by grace, through faith that we are saved, not by works. And yet, here comes this apocalyptic vision of God's judgment with Jesus the King separating sheep from goats. And it's all based on what they do and don't do. Do you see that? This is the kind of king that God has sent us. This is the king that says you can live in the goodness, in the light of God, by simply tending to all of those around you who are in need. Visiting the sick and the imprisoned, clothing the naked, feeding the hungry, ministering to people who need to be ministered to. This is how you live in the light of God. And in the same way, the way to live in this outer darkness, it's called, the skotos externos, the place of weeping and wailing and gnashing of teeth, is to refuse that. To refuse to be a part of what God is calling forth in the world, what God sends God's king to ordain. The ones who say, we never saw you sick or imprisoned or naked or hungry. And Jesus' response, the least of these that you saw there is me. There is the image that we are called to be looking for. Not at the bottom of a scorched pan or in the skin of a banana, but in the face of the hungry. Amen? Not in a piece of toast or a towel hanging on the rack and claiming some mystical visionary experience as a result of it, but in the face of those people who are oppressed and outcast, rejected, the others of the world. This is what our King ordains and calls us to. And so here at this place, when we proclaim Jesus King, Lord of Lords, ruler of all, we pledge ourselves to be followers of that King, to live the way and the truth and the life that he comes to reveal. That's what we celebrate on this day. Amen? Let's think a little bit about that as we hear some music.